Maryland has played a crucial role in the fight for civil rights, but it's a role that a lot of people here in Maryland are still unaware of. Here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, they have a new exhibit that's coming that aims to educate people about the past struggles and the fights that continue today. The Maryland Center for History and Culture in Park Avenue has a mission to educate a new generation.
You will actually hear the voices throughout the exhibition.
Allison Tolman told us the exhibit focuses on Maryland's rich but sometimes unknown historic ties to the civil rights movement.
Those civil rights was generational, and that it happened here in Baltimore, it happened here in Maryland, and it still continues to happen here today.
In 1968, Governor Agnew locked up nearly 300 students who marched for better conditions at Bowie State University. That struggle came nearly a half a century before a settled lawsuit that eventually provided millions in new funding for historically black universities. In the 1950s, local college students challenged racist systems by conducting sit-ins at segregated restaurants. This was years before the lunch counter protests farther down south.
Morgan State College was at the center of that. Other schools participated too. Johns Hopkins University had some people who were participating in the 1950s and into the 1960s.
Dr. David Terry is a history professor at Morgan State University, and he's written about confronting the Jim Crow era here in Baltimore City. We spoke with him extensively about this new exhibit at the museum. So here we have a museum that was started in spring, perhaps winter of 2020, before we saw the marches after George Floyd's death. Can you talk to us about the process that you went through to enable that seismic shift in our culture was represented in the museum?
I'll tell you, it's interesting for a person like me who writes about social justice movements and particularly for African Americans in Southern history and U.S. history, to see that a moment like that would blossom right when we're engaged in a project like this. Our society grows, our society develops when everyday people have these moments of coalescing, of coming together to achieve some specific goal or respond to some specific development. And while 2020, I think, was important in and of itself as a moment of that sort, it also stands in long line of other such moments where Americans have, for want of a better description, said, now I have to participate. I think the thing that is most significant about this exhibition, as opposed to other exhibitions, particularly about civil rights, is an intentional focus on the way everyday people have tried to participate.
You said in the presentation that history is often focusing on the elites, which is important, but a museum like this also brings the regular folks and their stories into the forefront as well.
In the civil rights history, we tend to focus on Martin Luther King Jr. and others like him, and rightly so. But as he has said, and the records tell us what he has said, he understands that he was standing on the shoulders of everyday people. He understood that even if he had not been born, as he famously said one time during the Montgomery bus boycott, he knew that the change that they were seeking was going to come because this is growing from the ground up.
The exhibit features audio recordings of everyday Marylanders telling stories in their own words. College professors say their students are desperate to learn more.
I've heard from many students the idea that they feel like they've been denied that history somewhat.
Dr. Joshua Davis is a professor at the University of Baltimore. He's a history professor there, and he specializes in conducting oral interviews and preserving history in that way. And these are projects that he's even worked on with the students. We spoke with him extensively about the importance of this exhibit.
I think with students today, something like the civil rights movement seems like a very long time ago and a very far place away. And what's so important about this exhibit is that it gets anyone who comes here to see that the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement were very much alive in Baltimore and in Maryland and very much focused on fighting racism in this city and state.
As a professor, what are you hearing from your students about the education that they believe they have received in high school versus now?
I've heard this from many different students, a feeling of I guess that they've been deceived a little bit, that they haven't been told the real truth of our country. Everyone knows a little bit about the civil rights movement, but I think a lot of students I've taught feel like the richness and the breadth and in some ways how dramatic and radical the movement was is not something they have been told about, especially not in schools, not in their formal education.
The fight for equality continues today. We saw it in 2020 after George Floyd's murder, after the mass shooting in Buffalo this past weekend that's now being investigated as a hate crime. This exhibit will attempt to break down barriers as the fight to live as equals in America rages on.
It lets you know that so much more needs to be done. So it's on us now. It's on the youth to make sure they keep the struggle real.
Professor Linda Day Clark is a visual artist and also a professor at Coppin State University. And even though she focuses on the sense of seeing, being a visual artist, she also talked about the importance of listening.
I think this is a powerful example of what a museum can do. I think although they're talking about listening to these oral histories, I think they've made it really visually impactful so that you see the action of the moment, you see all these historic photographs, and then you're struck with photographs that were literally like made yesterday. We included events that were unfolding as we were planning the exhibition. So it keeps that civil rights movement alive, not a point in history, but a continuing evolution and something that you and I are involved in. And the young people who come in might be inspired to make a mark in as well, right? It's all of our history. It's all of our history, black and white and whoever.
Miss Linda, here's the tough question. We see the history right over your shoulder, Brown v. Board of Education. We see the struggle. It's continuing today.
It continues today, and it will continue. And that's why we can't let it be lost in our collective memory. You have to keep it alive in people's thoughts to know that I must continue this fight. I must make a mark. I must do what I can to change the world. The only reason that I can walk into this museum is because someone fought. So what am I doing? How can I do this?
The exhibit opens on Friday, May 20th, and it will feature dozens of stories of Marylanders on their fight for equality then and now. Ava Joy Burnett for CBS News Baltimore.